Assuming you're back.
I am back, and I have the magic power, and we are recording.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm Thorbjorn Iverson. This class is Medieval Fire Pit Management. I'm from Caid, Barony of the Angels and Shire of the Isles, and that part of the world. And as anybody who knows me from before, I'm usually found around the cook fire in the camp when I go to war. So this is a bit of an effort to share some of my knowledge and research with people who are interested in fires for cooking, particularly at war. The perspective is going to be largely from a modern SCA perspective. So this is going to be largely practical. But I will talk about how what we do differs considerably from things that happened in period and why, and things like that. We're going to have a practical demonstration. We're going to have a fire, which I'm going to start first and then explain a little bit more about that as we go along, just so we can have a nice bed of coals by the time we need it for cooking. And then immediately afterwards, Lady Kong Lian will be coming along and using the fire to actually do some cooking in the Treats Along the Silk Road course, which comes up next. So as I said, I'm going to start in the middle. Ordinarily, if I was just to, if I had unlimited time, I would spend some time introducing what I'm doing and why and how to get that started, how to set up a fire. But I'm going to start the fire, let it go while we talk, and then come back to that. I'm going to emphasize three main thrusts here, tools and fuels and techniques. So things that you need to do to manage your fire pit properly. And I'll come back to the introduction a little bit more after I get going. And I just realized I need a mundane object that I don't have with me because I forgot to get it. So I'm going to run off to my kitchen in the house, and in 10 seconds, I'll be right back. Excuse me.
Where's everyone from? I'm from Mid-Realm. Did you guys already do this? Let's see how many kingdoms we can do.
I'm Flaming Griffin, Mid-Realm.
Yulia Sempronia on tier.
Judith Busra.
I'm from Onsteel.
I'm from Meridies.
And I'm another Meridian.
I'm from Avical.
I'm from the Mid-Realm.
Morgana, also on tier.
I'm from the west, and I'm driving.
I started stalling for you. I asked everyone what kingdom they were from.
Thank you so much.
I'm Sol from North Shield.
Castle Rouge North Shield, if I can get in there quick.
Oh, fantastic.
We also have another Avicalian. Marion usually stays on mute because of her bandwidth. So.
Great. Wow, well, we have a good crowd here today. So as I was explaining earlier, I'm starting in the middle. I'm actually lighting the fire right now, and then I'm going to talk later on about how to construct it, because I'd like it to be going, and so we can have a good fire going when we get to the point where we talk about techniques of fire management. So again, to review, I'm going to talk about tools and fuels, and about techniques, and basically, the perspective again is from the point of view of you're in an SCA camp and you're going to be doing period cooking, and you need an appropriate fire. So we're going to talk about how to do that, and a little bit less about how things were in period. First of all, a few notes on safety. Obviously, whenever you do fire stuff, you should have a nice big cleared area around your fire pit, and you should always have a appropriate sized fire extinguisher on hand, and water and sand if that is also appropriate. I think most of us are going to be rather experienced with campfires in one way or another, so this goes without saying, but I think I should start with that always. So to start with a bit about tools, first of all, in a period campsite, a period rough campsite, you probably would not carry a fire pit with you. You would probably dig a shallow pit and clear the whole area around where you're going to be working of any kind of vegetation and so forth and so on. So you have bare ground and a pit. The pit part is important because it allows you to control the airflow through your fire. We'll talk more about that later. But the airflow is kind of the biggest thing you need to worry about when you're doing a fire. And having a pit actually lets you control the airflow a little bit more than if it's just piled up on the ground. Now, my object that I use is a cast iron fire pit on legs. This satisfies most modern safety regulations, but it simulates a pit in the ground. It's rather shallow and round, and but it lets you, have that side walls, for example, and there are no holes in the sides or in the bottom of this. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that later. The other really kind of essential tool, other than a fire pit, either that you dug or that you brought with you, is a shovel. This is probably the only essential fire pit tool that you need. This is my shovel. It's relatively new and relatively modern in style. You can see lots of great examples of period fire pit shovels at your blacksmith vendor at the war and so forth and so on. And these shovels tend to be flat, tend to have a relatively flat head. This is pretty deep for a campfire shovel, right? But that allows you to slide it into your pile of coals or your pile of fuel very easily. Also, again, if you're working in period, you're working rough, you can use this to dig your fire pit. Then when you have your fire pit dug, you have a pile of soil on the side that you can also use to bury and extinguish your fire when you're done. Also for cooking, I don't know why that was ringing. Also for cooking, you need a fire to transfer coals from your fire pit, for example, where you may be generating coals, to your cooking surface. And so that's kind of the next tool I'd like to talk about, is a cooking surface. If you're going to be working with things like pipkins and ceramic or even cast iron cookware, you often don't want to stick them directly in the fire. You often want to have a situation where you can control the heat and have a place to set your pipkins. So I have this object over here to the left of the big fire pit is a cuticula. And this is a Roman style fire pit. It is a box, basically a box on legs, which has some adjustable grates, adjustable grate bars for setting on skewers or setting on pots or putting on your roast or something like that. And a couple wells that will hold pipkins. And so the idea behind this kind of object is that when you generate coals in your big fire, you can transfer them using your shovel over to here a little bit at a time so that you can heat up your ceramic cookware without it cracking. And I have to point out that these little guys on here with the cow faces are sort of Roman style spit holders that were made by the autocrat for this particular event, Mercy Newmark in LA. Can everybody still hear me okay? Is my microphone working all right?
Yes, and someone had a question. What was the name of the stove? It's just a Roman stove, right?
Yes, this one is called a craticula, C-R-A-T-I-C-U-L-A. And it was designed by Lady Kang Lian after an artifact that was found in the ruins of Pompeii. So there was an actual Roman artifact that looked exactly like this. And so this is basically a copy of that Roman piece. So again, the table is there to help you control the heat if you're cooking with pipkins or other sorts of ceramic things, and it keeps keeps your fire out of you know, out of your pots and so forth and so on. As you can see, I got quite a excessive fire going on here. I was in a bit of a hurry. So this is too much, but there's another tool which I'd like to talk about a little bit, which is optional, and it's tongs. I like to use tongs. These are modern. I'm still looking for a good pair of period style tongs. Don't actually think they were used very much in period in fires. Tongs were mostly a blacksmith thing. So I suspect that's a very non-period thing. I find them handy for manipulating coals on a very small scale and so forth and so on. But there's nothing you can do with the tongs that you can't also do with a little bit more care with your shovel. And lastly, one of the things that might be really useful to have is a trivet. So a trivet is a little metal, or in my case, ceramic stand that you can put on your fire table. This one is ceramic. If you can put it on your fire table, and you can arrange coals underneath it, and you can put something like a ceramic pot on top of it. So later on this morning, we'll be putting a big ceramic pot on top of there to cook a stew. So from the top, okay, yes, this is a good point for me to answer questions. Let me turn on the chat thing.
A question from chat. If you were in a hurry, why did you not start with thinner branches? Is there a reason you are using large logs?
Oh, really good question. We're going to discuss this when I talk about fuels some more, but I'm using what's available. I don't actually have a lot of small twigs right now that are good enough to work with, but a more realistic, more period fire would have smaller wood. We are very much spoiled in the modern era by having access to trunk wood and big lumps, big chunks of hardwood charcoal that probably were really not available to most people in period at any time. Because, for example, for making charcoal, they would often strip small branches off of trees in hopes that other ones would grow back. And so your charcoal would have been really small. No, what I did to make this go faster was I used more light wood in the middle, which you probably couldn't see, and I'll describe that in a little bit.
So did you use wood or did you use charcoal?
This is wood. So oftentimes I will start a cooking fire with wood and then use the heat generated from the hotter wood fire to ignite charcoal. So that's a good transition point. I will talk about fuels next. So I'm going to step back a little bit over to my informal wood pile. And there are several different kinds of fuels that you can use. You use different kinds of fuels to vary the heat and make your fire last longer or shorter. And sometimes, which is more of a modern thing than a period thing, to add flavor to your cooking. We'll start with something very familiar and common, softwoods like pine. This is actually a chunk of pine wood, which I've split. Pine and related woods are very lightweight. They tend to have a loose grain. They tend to burn very readily, in part because they dry out well, and they often contain a lot of natural resins. And the natural resins help them burn quickly. Softwoods, some examples are like pine, as I said, and cedar or juniper, birch or poplar. They're often light in color, and they often have this resin in them that helps them burn fast. So when you would use this is not necessarily the best fuel for cooking, but as an intermediate step in your fire pyramid, so to speak, going from the tinder to kindling to larger wood, you'll definitely want to have, if you have it available, have some softwood in there because it ignites quickly, burns hot and fast. And that will help you ignite your more recalcitrant wood. So more important to cooking is, of course, hardwoods. Hardwoods like oak and fruit woods they're very fine grained. They're often very dark in color as opposed to the light woods. They're redder or browner tone to them, denser grain, they're heavier. This chunk of wood weighs about twice as much as a piece of pine about the same size. So there's a lot more burnable stuff in here. But because it's heavier and denser, it's harder to light, tends to make more smoke, which can be desirable. Once it gets going, it'll make more smoke than a softwood fire. And again, it can add nice flavors. Things like hickory, for example, and fruit woods are often used in modern times to flavor your cook fire. So there's also specialty woods, which you use for particular purposes other than just creating fire. These are some twigs of fruit wood. This is, I think, a peach branch, and this is an apple. This one, I believe, is actually a citrus wood, piece of citrus wood, or actually maybe a piece of juniper. So these are often used to add, in modern times, to add flavor to a fire. It's not necessarily well documented in period that this was a big thing. There are occasional references in period recipes to say, oh, use this kind of wood to make your fire. But that's pretty much not common. I think in period, you would be really using whatever was local, whatever was available. So and again, in the SCA, we're really spoiled in that we have access to all sorts of things like this. The last kind of specialty wood is kind of fun. This is a chunk of what's called fat wood. This is from the heartwood of very, very, very resinous pitch pines. And so the pine wood has been used to extract pitch for sealing vessels or sealing vessels, sealing containers or sealing ships and all that kind of stuff. Pine pitch has been used ever since ancient times. And so production of pitch results in having the availability of this very resinous, very heavily soaked wood. It's very easy to set light. So a small amount of this, if it's, again, if it's available to you, will really help start your fire up quickly. Again, this is not necessarily tremendously well documented in terms of period, but pitch production is known to go all the way back to ancient times. And one of the references in my handout is actually from a discussion of Byzantine techniques in making pitch from which this sort of wood might have been available. So it goes back a ways. So when you think about structuring a cook fire, you generally have a phase that we're in right now with this fire where we're actually getting it started, getting going, and we're building up the bed of coals that you can use to cook with. You generally would want to use a hardwood for that. But even better than hardwood, of course, is charcoal. I have a bucket of charcoal here. I think everybody knows what charcoal looks like, but this is hardwood charcoal made from oak mostly. And what charcoal is basically wood chunks, wood twigs that have been heated up to the point where all the impurities are driven out. It's a process called pyrolysis. It goes back to even, before the ancient world, it goes back to prehistoric times. People have been intentionally making charcoal to use for fires, and they've been doing this forever. Forever, never, never. And the trick, it's a very, highly evolved skill about how you can basically burn wood without setting it on fire. So you can control the oxygen flow into there, so it's almost nothing. And then all the impurities basically get roasted out of the wood. What's left behind is almost pure carbon. So this would have been this was a very, very important thing throughout the entire Middle Ages, because when populations were growing enough, in the more heavily populated areas of Europe, for example, deforestation became a really large problem. And so regulation of forests was, you know, in part to assure that there would continue to be a supply of charcoal. So we generally get our charcoal in these big chunks made from, you know, trunk wood that's been split and roasted. Yes. Oh, wonderful question. Thank you. And charcoal briquettes are actually extremely modern. They are a 20th century invention. They're made from, for example, they originally made from sawdust that's pressed together and made into charcoal. And it's not from actually chips of wood. This process was, according to legend, invented as a way of using up waste sawdust from automobile production at the Ford Motor Company. So charcoal briquettes are a 20th century invention. They're not at all period. They often have impurities in them to bind the sawdust together to form these briquettes. And so they're deprecated. If you want to use a more period thing, you want to use hardwood lump charcoal. In the West, it's very easy to get mesquite lump charcoal, but mesquite, of course, is a New World plant. So you'd want to get hardwood charcoal that comes from other sources. But again, what we're using are these large chunks of big branches and heartwood and things like that that's been made into charcoal, and that's probably not very period. There's documentation of, you know, trees being stripped of branches gradually over their lifetime, you know, smaller branches to make charcoal from, as well as actually whole trees being cut down. But if you just take some of the branches off of a tree, you know, you can use the rest of the tree for other purposes. Bark was heavily used to extract tannins to tan leather. And so you would have wood as a byproduct of bark production for leather tanning, all that kind of stuff. So there are lots of different sources of wood, but your average person might actually have charcoal that comes in pretty small pieces. So it would conceivably burn faster. Smaller pieces always burn faster, and you know, would be expensive. So charcoal would be a pretty, you know, important part of your annual budget if you think about that. So making charcoal is actually probably a great source for another class. It was a profession that existed from prehistory into the 20th century, and there are still people who burn charcoal to this day. Time to take another break for questions. Does anybody have any questions about fuels as we continue on?
Nowadays, vine charcoal is used mostly by artists, but in our time period, was it used as fuel?
I haven't seen any documentation of particularly vine charcoal. Twigs of other plants. There's one particular kind of beech that the Germans call Faulbaum for lousy wood, but it actually makes a charcoal that you can powder very fine. And in very late period, it was very much in demand for making gunpowder. So when gunpowder came to Europe, people realized that the Faulbaum, which wasn't really great wood for anything else, made really splendid charcoal. But that tends to be a rather brushy thing, about the size of vine charcoal, I think the twigs were, yeah. But it powdered very well for some reason of the structure of the plant. So it was used for gunpowder. Late period. There's a question from Saul about favorite tinder materials, and I just learned about hoof fungus. Yes. So fire starting is a whole other class that I sometimes teach with Lady Hedovitz from the Shire of the Isles. That is a Norse thing. They would take shelf fungus, which grows on pine trees up in the North Woods, dry it out, treat it with urine, dry it out again, and it actually makes a pretty good tinder material. It makes a pretty good fire starting material. I haven't actually done this yet. I've gone so far as to collect shelf fungus, but I haven't peed on it yet. but I would like to do that at some point as a not as a demonstration. That's a bad word to use in this context, but to look at that. That was a really, tinder is often kind of hard to find, especially if you're in the north and things are always wet. And you know, here in California, you can just turn around and grab a hunk of dry grass almost any time of the year, and you have a really good source of tinder. One of the reasons I'm using fat wood today to start my fire is that I haven't really got any dry grass yet. It's too early. And Robert and Marie say, warning about cedar, it burns very hot and should only be used in outdoor fires. The resins will stick to the inside of a fireplace and cause your building to burn down. Yeah. So again, something about soft woods. They have these resins, and so do junipers and cedars, which are harder, but you know, they're the same sort of conifer family. They have a lot of resins in them that don't completely burn, and that can actually really heavily flavor your food if you're cooking on top of it, which may not be desirable. You may not want your roast to taste like a pine tree. And if you use them in your fireplace, you will have a lot more creosote building up on the inside of your chimney and should get it swept more often. So hardwoods are desirable for a lot of reasons, and not the least of which is they don't have as much of that resin. So they burn more slowly. They don't produce those undesirable flavors and all that kind of stuff. Tow left over from flax production makes good tinder for flint and steel. Yes. That's really good too. That's a good reminder that a lot of materials that were available to you know, people in period maybe aren't so available to us because we don't do these things. We don't make rope out of hemp, all that kind of stuff. Animal dung is a fuel that goes back to prehistory. We don't use it so much in the SCA for obvious reasons, because it kind of smells bad when you're burning it. But I think if you have it aged and dried out enough, it makes a perfectly reasonable fuel. I haven't talked about turf and peat. In places like Ireland, you can cut very thick, very carbonaceous plant material from bogs and stuff like that, and dry that out, and that also does make a pretty good fire. That's something I kind of neglected to talk about because, again, I'm sort of used to our SCA campfire thing where we're using wood and charcoal. But there are lots of other important fuels worldwide that are pretty big. And of course, we haven't talked about mineral coal. So fossil fuels were also available to the ancients sometimes to cook on. I hate cooking on coal. It tastes terrible, but you know, you can do it. It is definitely a fuel that you can use. Okay, so we're a little over halfway through. I'm going to actually start talking a little bit more about techniques now. And again, you know, apologies if a lot of this is familiar to people already, because you already have experience with fires, but you know, it's nice to think about it from the point of view of a theory and principle of how you do things. So like with starting a fire of any kind, you start with the smallest and finest material. You start with your char cloth or your tinder that you cast sparks onto, and you get a little flame from that, and then you can ignite larger twigs. And again, a nice sequence to use, a nice way to think about it is that you can use this sticky, fast burning, hot, not so great for cooking softwoods like pine to get your hardwood going. So hardwood is a little bit more tricky. So if you think about the old Boy Scout tripod, the Boy Scout pyramid, you've got your tinder and kindling down at the bottom in the center, and around that you've got pine wood. And then on top of that, you've got your hardwood, so that you get a chimney effect, and it lights that hot wood on the inside first and on the outside last. I have a couple pictures I'm going to show. So hang on just a sec while I set up to share the screen. I think I can do that. Here we go. Pretty sure I'm showing the wrong window here. Okay, is that better? So this is basically how I built the fire today. This is the bottom of the fire pit, and underneath all of this, I would put my tinder. So your paper, if you're modern, or your little tiny, wood scraps or twigs, small, very, very small, fine things like your shelf fungus, that will go underneath here. I've built a little bit of a scaffold with softwood chunks. And on top of that, I've piled some fat wood. So this would be, analogous to kindling and all that kind of stuff. And on top of that, you've got more of larger pieces of the softwood. Again, you're kind of making a little pyramid here. And then around that, you've got these larger chunks of hardwood. Okay, so you're basically building kind of a pyramid thing. I have to explain that the object I'm using here, you can see it pretty well on the screen now. This is a Mongolian fire ring. And so the Mongolian horsemen on the steppes would carry these ring structures with them. I think they could probably disassemble them. This is one that Kong Lian designed that's actually permanent. But the rings actually help you make a columnar structure for your fire, and that helps with airflow. So let's talk a little bit about the fire pit and airflow. One of the things that's really nice about using a fire pit that's kind of like this one, or digging a fire pit, is that you have less airflow below the level of the walls. So you can use that wall as a barrier to the airflow. Okay, so, or you can use something like this Mongolian fire ring stand to hold your stuff up so it doesn't topple down and it stays up above the level of the pit and in the airflow. Okay, so when you have more airflow, your fire will burn quicker and it will burn hotter. This is not always desirable. If you want a nice bed of coals for making, for heating up your ceramic cookware, what you want to do is have that fire low, down below the level of the fire pit. Okay, so I'm using the Mongolian fire rings to get this fire started, and we've got it started. It's really going fast now. I'm gonna go grab my gloves, I'm gonna pull it out. And I think I'm gonna drag the camera a little bit closer so you can see more clearly what some of the things I'm talking about. This is the blow up the lab step, as one of my colleagues in chemistry used to say. Okay. So as you can see now, hopefully, I've got a pretty good fire going. And we are almost calm right now, so there's not very much wind. Famous last words, the wind is suddenly coming up and swirling around, but you can see that down below the level of the pit rim, then the airflow is lower. Things when it was sticking up higher, it was generating more airflow and more heat. I get my shovel and move this around. So the big thing in managing a fire pit, again, is once you get it started, once you get your hardwood going, is to regulate that airflow to keep the fire going, but keep it at a heat level that will do the work you want it to do. So if you could actually suspend, if you had a spit, you could suspend a spit above this fire and it would work okay. You would have to have it pretty high because it's a pretty hot fire, but you couldn't use this at this point to cook with a pipkin, for example. It's just too hot. So our goal with this fire is to generate some coals. So again, the most important trick for regulating the airflow is to keep the fire down below the level of the pit rim. And you know, if you have a consistent wind, which I don't today, so it's hard to demonstrate that, but if you have a consistent breeze, one nice trick that you can do is you can push your fire up to the upwind side, right? That will, what I'm doing is pushing it to the upwind side to slow it down. And what happens in that case is you get a laminar airflow over that corner, and it's more windy on the far side, the downwind side of the fire pit than on the upwind side. So that's one way to slow it down. If you need to speed it up, you could do the actual opposite. One important thing you can do to speed up or slow down your fire is to pile it closer together or spread it out. If you spread it out, it will go faster. Just because you're creating more surface area that's available for the fire to reach, so it'll burn more quickly. The most difficult thing, I think, at this point, and what I think a lot of people who are sort of just getting used to building fires, is the question of when to add more fuel. And from the perspective of a long duration cook fire, you want to keep your fire burning as slow as you possibly can, so you don't have to add fuel as often. I mean, a really hot fire, you can go through a whole bundle of firewood in an hour, and then you haven't got enough left to cook with. So the balance there is in between having enough heat to keep your fire going. You can just discourage it, particularly if you're using all hardwood. You can discourage it to the point where it will go out, and then making sure you have enough wood to last. You want to be thrifty about it. So let's see, how well can you see? Tip this down a little bit more. So as you can see, underneath the big chunks of wood here, we see pieces breaking off. And so those are hot coals. You could shovel these out with your shovel and bring them over to your cooking surface to use around ceramic cookware or iron cookware, for example, if you were going to do that. Another thing you can do with the hot coals is you could ignite some charcoal. So I have some lump charcoal, which I will get started just by putting it on here. Okay, so the charcoal itself is denser and has fewer impurities, so it'll make less smoke and it'll burn longer. It'll also burn at a more moderate temperature. So I think a good rule of thumb to say about charcoal is that it's medium temperature. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. So it's kind of ideal for doing a lot of the cooking things that we want to do. But if you have a nice bed of hot coals, then that's good for spit roasting, for example. But again, it takes a lot more wood to do it that way. I'm going to review my notes here to make sure I haven't really missed anything important that I wanted to talk about.
And we do have just about 5 more minutes.
Yep, I think I'm actually kind of done with the meat of the presentation, and I would like to allow some time for people to ask questions. So I'm going to move my camera back to where I was. Okay, thank you. Great. All right, I'm going to look at the chat reel first for questions. I'm certainly going to open this up for questions. I'll ask Lady Morgana pointed out something good about having a hot softwood fire, for example. It burns fast. And so if you're having a social fire at night and you don't want to stay up all night watching it, you can use the hotter, faster burning wood, and it will burn out more quickly, and you don't have to stay up all night watching it, which is a good thing. Coal, yes, mineral coal is fine for radiant cooking, like broiling on a spit next to the fire. Absolutely, yes. Especially in things like a fired oven, for example. If you have a clay oven that you can get really hot, you know, that's a good way to do it. Couple questions on, okay, a question on raised fire pits. Can I recommend good suppliers? So a lot of the custom work that Lady Kong Lian had done was done by a company called NorCal Oven Works. They're actually in West Texas, but they make some nice fire tables and things. They're quite good, but they sort of specialize in the great big fire pit company. This one that we have here came with a lot of nice accessories like grills and spit forks and all that kind of fun stuff. That we got that at Costco. It occasionally appears. It's called, the brand name is River Grill. I've stripped off a lot of the features from it to make it easier to transport because I do bring it to war. But it has, you know, it's pretty good. It's been very solid. I've had it for years and years and years. Saul is asking a really good question. How long before desired cooking time do you start your fire for coals? That's a really good question because I think I never really allow long enough. I might start, depending on how big my fire is going to be and how long I need it to last, I might start as much as an hour ahead of time. Certainly an hour ahead of time to start laying the fire, planning what I'm going to use and how I'm going to do it. Couple minutes left. I have time for questions.
I take it from what you have said that ceramics should never be over fire actual flames, that they should always be used on coals.
Good, yes. Well, as Baroness Collette, who's going to, I believe, is teaching the cooking in clay classes, don't become too attached to your ceramics because they will eventually break. The big thing about cooking with ceramics is you need to heat them up slowly. And with actual fire, it's sort of hard to do that. Once you get it hot and you have it in, you know, it's all sort of evenly heated. The problem is uneven heating. And if it's, you know, heats up too much on one side and expands too much, it'll crack, you know, the other side where it isn't heated up as much. So you want to heat it up evenly and slowly as you possibly can. So coals tend to be the way to do that with them in the most controlled way. You can cook with ceramic on top of actual fire. I wouldn't do it unless you've really, really guaranteed you've preheated your pot. Yeah, single use, yeah, exactly. Source for the iron cylinder thingy, that was a custom job that Lady Kong Lian had a blacksmith make for her. But you can definitely see examples of this in modern Mongolia and in medieval Mongolia as well. More questions. You guys are great. You've been a really wonderful audience. I've loved your questions and comments. This is great. Well, you're all very welcome. Go back to poking at my fire. It is about time to add more wood, by the way. That was a really hot, fast one, so I think I'm going to be adding more wood to this about now to make sure that Lady Kong Lian has enough to cook with for her class, which is coming up in 10 minutes.
I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.